It's Thursday, the 8th of September. This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative peer Ed Vaizey, Labour MP Stella Creasy, Daily Mail Deputy Political Editor John Stevens and former Liberal Democrat advisor Polly Mackenzie. Today, the Prime Minister unveils her plan to deal with rising energy bills.
This government is moving immediately to introduce a new energy price guarantee that will give people certainty on energy bills.
Labour supports a cap but says energy companies should pay.
The Prime Minister is opposed to windfall taxes. She wants to leave these vast profits on the table.
The government also lifts the ban on fracking. Will it lead to more protests like this? Yet more sewage released into the sea. Is nationalisation the answer?
Will he now cut the crap? Will he commit to strengthening the government's plan and bring our failing system back into public hands where it belongs?
So the Prime Minister has opened today's debate on how to protect households and businesses from soaring energy bills by putting a limit on the average annual household bill. We'll hear from Liz Truss in just a moment. But first of all, I just want to show you this headline in The Times. Ministers will implore public to cut use of power. With that package being announced, consumers being shielded from the rising price of wholesale gas to a certain extent, should the government be telling people to use less energy? Ed?
Yes, it should be telling people to use less energy. I mean, I don't want to... I think there was a moment on television when Edwina Currie was holding up a piece of silver Bako foil that you sort of put behind the radiator to generate more heat. And one of the things I've been asking actually for the last few days, in the spirit of always asking stupid questions, is what is the government's plan to cut its own use of energy? There must be not just obviously public buildings, which probably wouldn't touch the size, but there must be huge energy-intensive government-sponsored operations which could potentially be suspended, just as operations were suspended during COVID. This is an energy pandemic, if you like, and there must be big, significant cuts you can make in government energy. Right. So government should lead from the front, showing what it's doing here. But I see nothing wrong with talking to the public and saying these are ways you can save energy use. There's nothing wrong with that.
Talking to the public or directing the public in a slightly more official way? I mean, Emmanuel Macron is encouraging people to use 10% or around that amount less energy. Switzerland going a little further and threatening to jail people if they put their heating on above 19 degrees, which is somewhat draconian.
Yeah, well, I think what we're seeing across Europe is planning and forethought about the fact that we need to reduce the amount of energy that people are using. And actually, I agree with Ed. I mean, one of the reasons why the NHS is in trouble at the moment is the rising energy bills that it has to pay. I think there's a big difference between the frankly insulting moment where someone like Edwina Currie says, oh, just put a jumper on or put a piece of tinfoil behind your radiator, and some of the things that could have happened if the government was thinking about this. I mean, I'm very mindful of 10, 12 years ago when the Labour government gave us investment in solar panels that meant that people had solar energy in their houses, which cut the amount of energy they were taking from the grid because they were contributing as well. One of the things that we're calling for is investment in energy efficiency as one of the ways that you both tackle the cost of these bills, but you also reduce the amount of energy that people need in the first place. What I'm very worried about is the constituents of mine who have things like medical equipment in their households, and the idea they might face blackouts is a life or death situation. So of course we need government to be much better at thinking about these things.
And will people almost expect it, or will they rail against being told to use less energy? I mean, there has been some discussion already that because there is this energy package now being announced, it will disincentivise people to turn down their heating.
Well, I think the energy prices have gone up so much that I'm not sure that that is going to... You know, I don't think you're going to see people just turning on their radiators for the fun of it this winter, because it is so expensive. Even when the cap comes in, it's going to be so expensive. I don't think you're going to see that being a problem. But it's a tricky line for the government to trudge. You know, they don't want to be seen as being patronising. They don't want to be seen as diminishing people's problems. You know, the idea that you'll be able to sort out your bills and make things add up if you just put on a jumper and turn your thermostat 1 degree. The government's not going to want to do that. But it's not just about costs. costs, it's about energy supply. And there are concerns that we won't have enough energy to go round this winter. And I think that's why you might see the government slightly change its message. We heard Simon Clarke, who's the new Levelling Up Secretary this morning, talking about how people need to be more disciplined this winter and talking about how we could preserve energy. So I think you might see the government say more, but not necessarily start to say specific things, put on a jumper, turn down your heaters.
Polly?
John's completely right that at £2,500 for average consumption, the incentives are still really sharp to consider things like turning the thermostat down, wearing jumpers. There's good advice from a money-saving expert about heating the human, not the home, if you are short of cash. And as Stella says, there are groups of people, particularly people with disabilities, who have very high energy costs that they can't constrain. There's the previous package of support, there's now this cap. The question is every group getting enough support? There are some where there's still not enough, especially disabled groups, and of course students who've been completely left out of any direct support with.
Just going back to your earlier point, Joe, that this is not a government that's going to tell people what to do, as in, it's full of lockdown sceptics who really railed against Boris Johnson's government putting in these draconian laws about the pandemic. But I see nothing wrong. I would like it as an individual to get tips from the government about how to save energy and how to reduce your energy consumption. And with every crisis, I hope this doesn't come out wrong, but with every crisis, there is an opportunity. If people can long-term learn how to use energy more efficiently, that will be a good thing.
Well, we're going to drill down into the substance of it and look at all of the issues that you've mentioned. Let's hear some of what the Prime Minister had to say.
From the 1st of October, a typical household will pay no more than £2,500 per year for each of the next 2 years while we get the energy market back on track. This will save a typical household £1,000 a year. It comes in addition to the £400 energy bill support scheme. We will deliver this by securing the wholesale price for energy while putting in place long-term measures to secure future supplies at more affordable rates.
And that debate is ongoing in the House of Commons. The sort of headline, John, if you like, is what we expected, that bills would be capped effectively, the average annual household energy bill at around £2,500. What else has she said?
So as well as helping households, she's helping businesses for the first time, and groups like church groups and charities. They're also going to be helped. But the household help is going to be in place for 2 years, keeping the average bill at £2,500. The help for businesses is going to last about 6 months. And then at some point in that 6-month period, they'll decide how they can do more targeted support afterwards. She's also looking at energy supply. So one of the things that they're lifting the ban on is fracking. And they're also going to set up, like we had the vaccine supply task force in the pandemic. One of the people who helped to run that is going to run an energy supply task force. And they're going to look at how we can negotiate deals with suppliers across the world and try and get hold of cheaper energy.
All right, well, let's just talk about, we'll put fracking just to one side and boosting domestic supply. We'll come on to it in just a moment. Are you happy with what you've heard so far, Ed?
Yes, I'm not an energy policy expert, but listening to it as a layman, it seemed to me that Liz Truss, the Prime Minister, was saying, addressing all the right things, obviously addressing front and centre people's very real concern about the level of their energy bills, giving them a clear signal of what they're likely to pay for their energy, and then looking to the medium to long term, which is absolutely what we want to do. I mean, we've all become, to a certain extent, energy experts, just as we became pandemic experts, and we've learned that money doesn't make the world go round, it's energy makes the world go round, and we need energy security based on renewable energy, which can be done, which will actually be good for our economy and
all right, well,
pro-growth.
I mean, just to compare it to what we've heard from the Labour Party, it is less generous, isn't it? Because Labour wanted to effectively cap that average bill at around 1,900 as opposed to 2,500, and also pensioners and those on benefit would still receive the £650 that was outlined by Rishi Sunak in the original package. Why can't that be included too?
Well, it's a judgment call for the government, and the government's clearly taken a view in terms of what it feels it can afford and can be afforded, because a lot of this will obviously come from borrowing, and what is a sensible level to cap energy bills at. I mean, we can argue between 1,900 and £2,500, and that's real money for real people, and it can make a big impact on household budgets. And no doubt Labour will perhaps run the argument, just as politicians through the ages run the arguments about level of taxes and levels of benefits, about the level of the energy price cut.
You broadly agree with what's being outlined, and you think it's necessary.
This is a cost of living crisis. It's not just a cost of energy crisis. No. So actually, for months, we've all been saying our constituents are really struggling. What are we doing about it? And the length of time it has taken for any solution to come forward at all. So I welcome the fact that the government has come forward with a solution. My challenge is whether it is enough, and also who is going to pay for it. Because people are struggling with bills right now. And Liz Truss, new Prime Minister, trying to echo Thatcher, talking about managing a household. Well, this is like putting your gas bill on your mortgage bill. The amount of borrowing that the government is going to undertake is going to come back and bite my constituents. And I look at these companies who have made a massive, excessive profit over these extreme prices that people have been paying. And I think it's right. The public are saying, well, hang on a minute, why aren't they sharing the load? They've benefited from this crisis. Why aren't they paying?
Well, let's have a look at Labour's proposal in terms of raising, from Labour's own figures, just over £8 billion from another windfall tax on those producers that you're talking about. Well, £8 billion out of the £29 billion that Labour was proposing, because your proposal to freeze bills or cap bills was only going to last 6 months. And this is a 2-year plan. So in a sense, has the government not got the scale of it?
That was a plan that we came up with several months ago to deal with the immediate crisis then. And we've always said we'd look again at what was happening in April.
But you accept that
bear in mind these companies
wouldn't meet though anything like the amount. So you would have to borrow.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm simply saying you're comparing apples with pears, because you're talking about a government, to be fair, it's come forward with the plan for the next 2 years. These are companies that are going to make £200 billion in extra profit. That is quite a substantial profit to make. So I think it would be completely fair in April again.
200 billion.
200 billion is the estimated extra profit that these companies
now,
are
they
making.
would, of course, say that they have had losses in previous years, mainly, of course, during the previous to the pandemic, and that these profits have already been taxed highly. But the point, I suppose, that's important is it wouldn't raise the sort of money that you need.
I disagree with you on that, and I think that there is
your own figures
evidence.
say that.
Well, no, I think there's, because also what you're talking about is tackling the inflationary costs of energy and price as well, that it would have done by doing what we're doing. So it's a balancing act. My point is, by putting the cost of this back onto the consumer, we are storing up more problems for my constituents who are already finding they can't really afford to heat or eat because they haven't got the money for either right now. So the question for me is, this is a short-term fix, but actually those longer-term challenges, where we need stable government to think about investing in energy, to be able to tackle the other costs that people are facing. We haven't talked about childcare, we haven't talked about the cost of mortgages, of rent. Those things are still coming down the line at them, and this won't help that.
Absolutely. Let's stick, though, with this announcement. I mean, do you agree with Stella on the issue of borrowing? Why not have that windfall tax, another windfall tax on those excess profits? Why put all of this for future generations to pay back?
I hope I don't appear too trivial, but the politics of this is very interesting from the Prime Minister Liz Truss's point of view. I mean, whether you agree with her on the windfall tax or not, she's been very clear about it, and I think actually the public will respect her. They will say, at least we have a Prime Minister who has made it very clear what her view is. She clearly has said, in words of one syllable, she regards a windfall tax as being something that puts off investment in the UK, and goodness knows, given where the pound is and so on and so forth,
we'll come on to
that we need business investment in this country. So she's made a clear decision whether you agree with it or not. The second thing is, again, to be slightly Machiavellian about this, borrowing is on the never-never. The public today do not see the impact of borrowing 20 or 30 years down the line. They are quite understandably only concerned about the size of the bill.
Sure. Well, is that the calculation that's being made, Polly, to some extent, that actually, as long as people are getting a reasonable amount of help, then they worry about how it's going to be paid for further down the line or not at all?
I think that's certainly true in the immediate. But as Stella says, people are still going to be suffering through this winter. So the idea that they will just automatically think, oh, the government's so nice, I'm so happy, is perhaps a little naive. And then, crucially, the question of who pays and exactly who absorbs this cost of what has happened, which is that we are poorer as a country, whoever bears that cost, is going to, I think, be massive through the next general election. And it is, as Ed says, a political judgment, but it's a brave political judgment to be on the side of the energy companies going into the next election instead of on the side of, a windfall tax, which again the Conservative government has just introduced one, so they can't be so profoundly.
John, but just briefly, I would say if you weren't reducing people's energy bills and you were letting the energy companies off the hook, yes, you would be in trouble with the public. But the public care only, quite rightly, about what their bill says.
The most important thing for all of this, actually, is what it's doing over the long term. And Liz Truss has framed it that way. We want to do this whilst we fix this. But if you're not talking about renewables, and if you're not talking about energy efficiency and insulating homes, which, of course, we massively reduced in order to reduce levies on bills are super, super controversial. We saw that. It's why we've got into this mess.
But just going back to the windfall tax, I mean, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak were clear that they didn't want a windfall tax. And the reason that they brought one in, because that position became unsustainable. Because you've got the situation where these big energy companies report their profits every quarter. You know, we're going to, in a few weeks' time, I don't know when exactly BP's results are coming out, or Shell or whatever, we're going to have a series of them coming out saying we're making all these billions of pounds of profits, and we'll come back to this debate again.
Yes, I'm sure we will, time and again. Let's talk about something else you mentioned, John, which is about fracking and actually lifting the ban on fracking. It was introduced 3 years ago. This is going to be part of boosting domestic supply. Is that a good idea, Ed?
I've never had a particular problem with fracking. I've never understood why people say that fracking is the sort of the beginning of the end and the road to hell, and we're going to have sort of bring it on.
If you were still a constituency
provide
MP,
valuable income.
If you were still a constituency MP, would you still feel the same?
No, of course not, because obviously I'd want.
Right.
The point is that I've never seen why fracking should cause San Francisco earthquakes and start earthquakes, and I do think, you know, fracking has worked in other countries, and it is a source potentially of again energy security and energy self-reliance. So I think the government is right to continue to look at this, and frankly any innovation that involves the use of land is opposed. Building a nuclear power station is opposed. Building a wind farm is opposed. Fracking will be opposed.
Stella?
By local people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually, frankly, a red herring in all of this debate because I
no
don't
one's
know
going to sign up to it.
a single person. What we should be doing is investing in that renewable energy that makes us more energy sufficient. So wind farms, and yes, there probably is a case for nuclear. The biggest thing about all of this, these are not new debates. This is my frustration, is for years we've been talking about the need to do more about energy security, and now we are at the crisis point. And we've got, what, our 5th Prime Minister in as many years, and still that sense of chaos about it. So bringing fracking into this mix is just going to further...
But it's all about planning. It's all, you know, HS2 is the same argument. We spend years and years and years debating what is essentially necessary for the long-term future of this country.
And interestingly, there may be problems from senior members of government. I mean, this was Kwasi Kwarteng, now the Chancellor, back in March this year, saying if we lifted the fracking moratorium tomorrow, it would take up to a decade to extract sufficient volumes, and it would come at a high cost for communities and our precious countryside.
That echoes the famous Nick Clegg comment.
So that's what, you know, Nick Clegg is now pilloried for having said that about nuclear. And, you know, in the end, you know, you are rewarded in the long term for the trees you choose to plant today. If fracking was a good idea, it doesn't matter that it takes a decade, we should do it. I would put money, serious money, down on the fact that there will just not be any. We have huge amounts of renewables, particularly solar and wind, that already have planning permission. We have a ban on onshore wind, even where there's local support, which is stupid. Actually, if this, you know, this energy supply chain task force people have any wits about them, the first thing they will do is be trying to get those renewables, which already have planning permission, actually built out and operational. It's so important. Fracking, as Stella says, is a complete distraction. It's not going to happen because it needs to happen if it happens in Conservative constituencies, and those local
Polly, this
people
clip will be played in a decade's time when this government doesn't do fracking.
And Ed has several of the mines in his back garden, and it will be...
Do you agree it's just not going to happen, or it's unlikely to happen unless people are incentivised with reductions or discounts in their bills?
I mean, I don't think it's going to happen. I think that's the only way you do make it happen is by giving people discounts on their bills. But I just don't know what sort of discount would you have to offer people. You know, we just can't get houses built in this country at the moment. That's enough of a problem. The idea that suddenly people are going to say, well, that's fine, let's have people fracking down the road, I just think it's going to be really tricky.
If you're going to take on the NIMBYs, take them on for some homes for people to live in, not to sink a fracking well.
All right, well, it looks like that's dead in the water before it's even begun. Let's just show you this headline. Polly, you, I think, said earlier on that it's a gamble, that this big economic package to tackle cost of living is a gamble. This is a headline: Truss reveals energy gamble as pound hits to 1985 low. Apparently, it's picked up very slightly, but it has been falling. The economic backdrop following yesterday's committee hearing with the Bank of England governor saying that the UK is probably likely heading into recession. How much of a gamble is this? I mean, does it make any difference what she's announcing today in terms of the economic backdrop for the UK?
I think it will make a difference. There are huge numbers of businesses that would go to the wall if they were not supported with their energy bills in this period, as well as, you know, a range of public services that would be affected. And that would lead to redundancies. She said she's going to get the UK working again. We don't actually have an unemployment problem. We have a labour shortage problem. But nevertheless, you could see a recession feeding into...
Well, if businesses start to cut staff and...
So just like furlough, this effort to protect businesses, keep businesses alive as we try and build a better energy system will make a difference and is a good choice. I don't think it necessarily fixes inflation because there's so many other input costs. Plus, if the pound falls, makes it easier for us to export, but pushes up the cost of imports, and we rely on lots and lots of imported goods.
I mean, Liz Truss has said today, as I understand, that her announcement will reduce inflation by 5 percentage points. Do you agree?
Well, I think tackling energy prices will certainly have an impact on inflation. But let's be honest about this. You don't get growth in our economy just by saying the word growth in the Parliament.
I'm going to interrupt you now. We're going straight into the House of Commons and listen to the Speaker.
If there is anything else, we will update the House accordingly. Thank you. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm sure on behalf of all colleagues that we're saddened to hear the announcement that's been made, and the thoughts and prayers of all of us will be with Her Majesty the Queen and indeed with the royal family. Mr Speaker, in reality, the one big political question, the real question, was how today's plan would be paid for and who would pay for it. And ever since
I'm just going to interrupt Ian Blackford because we actually missed the obviously very critical part of what the Speaker was saying, Lindsay Hoyle, which is that the Queen's health has obviously gone downhill to some extent. She is in poor health. He obviously wanted to inform the House. We all saw, of course, the picture of Her Majesty the Queen meeting Liz Truss, her 15th Prime Minister during her reign just a few days ago. But at the moment, that is all the information we have following Lindsay Hoyle's announcement that doctors are concerned. And that is all of the detail that we have at the moment. If we get any further developments, we will bring them to you. But that was actually what Lindsay Hoyle was saying. Ian Blackford there, the leader of the SNP in the Commons, was responding, obviously saying that he, like everyone else, is concerned. Let's talk about this story in the Daily Telegraph. British Bill of Rights shelved as Liz Truss faces pressure to sideline ECHR, the European Court on Human Rights. In one of her first acts as Prime Minister, she told the Cabinet there were better ways to reform human rights law. This is actually about the European Court of Human Rights, which was set up in the 1950s. It's nothing to do with the European Union. The former Justice Secretary, you may remember, Dominic Raab, brought forward a Bill of Rights which he hoped would limit the influence of the European Court. That, as you can see from the headline, has now been scrapped. But the government is planning to bring forward alternative proposals. The new Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has previously backed pulling out of the European Convention on Human Rights altogether. She argued it was necessary in order to deliver the government's controversial policy of sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. But it's thought the government is not at this moment planning to pull out of the European Court. Let's talk to Martin Howe QC. He's previously advised the government on these issues. He's also backed pulling out of the ECHR. Martin, welcome to the programme. What's your reaction to the government scrapping this bill?
Well, in a sense, I'm not that surprised. I think the problem with the bill is that it falls between two stools. It's radical enough to foment a lot of opposition, a lot of difficulty with getting it through, particularly getting it through the House of Lords, but unfortunately not radical enough actually to solve the underlying problem. And the underlying problem is the European Court of Human Rights at Strasbourg which has spent the last 50 years embellishing the Convention, which itself is a sensible document, with large numbers of doctrines which simply are not in the Convention and were never contemplated by the states who drafted it.
Will it be more difficult for the government to do things like their Rwanda policy if we stay in the ECHR?
I think it does cause difficulties. The so-called interim indications which stopped the deportation flight are a good example, and that's a good example of judicial overreach by the Strasbourg Court, where the Convention itself does not confer on them any right to make binding interim orders. But maybe they could tackle that, possibly with more focused and targeted legislation.
What do you think the government is likely to do?
I think, as Martin said, it's likely that they will look more at something more targeted to deal with this specific problem, that bill that they had been bringing forward become a very big vehicle. There were lots of different things being thrown into that. And I think part of the reason that they didn't want to replace the Human Rights Act wholesale is because at the moment, when these things go wrong, they can blame Labour's Human Rights Act and say, oh, it's all Labour's fault that we can't put these people on a plane and send them to a different country. And if they completely replace that with a British Bill of Rights, as Dominic Raab was planning to do, if that didn't deliver and they still had planes grounded, then people would say, well, it's the fault of the Tory Bill of Rights, and that would completely ruin that argument.
Was it the right decision to scrap Dominic Raab's life work, it seemed, on the Bill of Rights?
Yeah, I think Dominic Raab was absolutely furious that people like Robert Buckland, for example, were campaigning against it. I think Robert wrote a piece during the leadership election saying it was a mistake, and it was something that he was very passionate about. And he was, of course, an international lawyer, so he clearly had an articulate point of view. I mean, I think Martin Howe makes a very important point there, in the sense that, you know, we are not used to having political courts in the UK, and you only have to see with the US Supreme Court and the overturning of Roe versus Wade what happens when you have political courts. They become part of the political system, and I would not want to see us withdraw from the European Convention. It's an incredibly important document about post-war Europe and the kind of guardrails of post-war Europe. But there is definitely an argument to say that courts then embellish a document and put their own doctrines forward. But never forget, the Human Rights Act was brought in to allow people in the UK to go to UK courts to get judgments on their human rights rather than having to go to Strasbourg.
Right,
So
but can the government pursue its policy, its Rwanda policy, while the UK is still part of the ECHR?
Well, it's quite interesting. I think the government decided not to challenge the Strasbourg court on its interim ruling because it didn't want to have that fight, but it is still pursuing its Rwanda policy, even though it's finding it difficult, partly because of action in the UK courts to get people physically on a plane and fly them to Rwanda. So don't forget the UK courts themselves can provide important safeguards, if that's how you want to view it, in terms of these issues. But I take Martin's point that there's still life in this debate in terms of putting in measures in UK domestic legislation that may potentially curtail the action of the European Court, not the European Convention.
No, well, is that the case, though, Martin? Because many people are at pains to understand how domestic laws or legislation will ever override international law.
Well, there's international law and there's things that aren't international law, like assertions by the Strasbourg Court that it has power to grant interim relief, which have no foundation in international law. But
taking account of those sorts of rulings, it is part of our law too, isn't it?
Well, what's happened, the Human Rights Act had a number of unfortunate features. One is that it put a mandatory duty onto our domestic courts to take account of Strasbourg Court decisions, rather than leaving our courts free to depart from them if they felt they went beyond the Convention. And indeed, the bill, that's an issue that the bill would have dealt with.
Right. Well, Stella, what's your reaction? Let me get Stella's reaction to that in terms of the...
Yeah, and look, I just think I ought to say on behalf of all the panel, we're all desperately concerned about the Queen and worried about her family because I think we can't let that go. There is another way of looking at this, Martin, that many of us who are on the Council of Europe and see this, it wasn't actually Labour's Human Rights Act. Obviously, it was Churchill who set up our involvement in the European Court of Human Rights. And he did that for a very good reason, which was about protecting citizens from overbearing governments of any political persuasion. Were we to leave the European Court of Human Rights, as Suella Braverman has said, we honestly, and it was her term that it was the honest way to be able to deport torture victims from our country to a third country, then we would, well, actually, Martin, the evidence is quite clear that there are torture victims who they've been threatening to deport to Rwanda, then we would be in the same category as Belarus and indeed Russia as not part of it. And I served on the Council of Europe where we had scrutiny and involvement in that European court. The challenge here is that that Bill of Rights wasn't actually a Bill of Rights. It was about setting out the boundaries of where that bill and where the courts could make judgments. And for many of us, so I tried to amend this a bit, and I had an amendment ready to go.
Yes, we'll come on to that in a minute, but let's stick with this.
Because this was about where the competing claims with human rights. Human rights are not unfortunate, Martin. They are a sign of a dignified human society, and that's why Churchill championed them, as well as the Labour government and indeed Jack Straw.
Martin?
Well, the problem is that Churchill, in Churchill's time, they agreed a convention which I think would attract universal support across the political spectrum. Yeah. But what's happened over the years since is that we have had very much out of control international judges who have transformed the original meaning of that convention into something very different. And what you have are judges entering into political questions which should be decided by democratically elected legislators and governments rather than by judges.
So they are interpreting our laws because we have put forward. So a good example of this was about votes for prisoners. A judgment came down from Strasbourg. We then interpreted it here in the UK. I'm sorry, I just don't agree with the categorisation that you're putting forward. I think from a libertarian perspective, it is very important to have an agency that my citizens, my constituents can complain to if they feel that the government hasn't upheld their rights. And that's why I'm desperately worried to have a Home Secretary who thinks the answer is...
That's called the British courts. They can complain. They can take the government to court.
But they also have the check and balance of being able to go to the European Court of Human Rights. And that's why people are saying, actually, we shouldn't leave it because it provides an important protection for your freedom and for your liberties, and why it's very troubling to have a Home Secretary who, rather than deal with the problems in the asylum system, wants to deport people who are victims of torture to a third-party country so we can forget about them, which isn't, again, the mark of a civilised society.
Martin, we're going to say goodbye to you at this point, but thank you very much for joining us. Polly, the Home Secretary has previously said the only way to take control of our borders and do things like the Rwanda policy is to pull out of the ECHR altogether. Is she right?
Human rights, as Stella says, are supposed to be a constraint on the government. So, in one sense, it's quite normal for the government to get cross about them. They want to do something, and they are prevented from doing so. That's a tension that is actually the mark of a healthy constitution that protects individuals. Democracy is absolutely the best system of government, but at its worst, it is the tyranny of the majority. And the fact that the government, which was elected by more people than any other party got, but still not 100% of people wants to do it, doesn't necessarily mean they should be able to. And I think this government just struggles really with thinking through the reality that there should be constraints against what they can do, because there should also be constraints against what a Labour government should do, or any form of government should be able to impose upon its citizens. It would be much better if we found a way to have this conversation about the nature of individual rights within our constitution as part of a proper debate about the constitution. We have this sort of mishmash bits and pieces of documents. We're constantly trying to sort of add plasters and fixes to enable things, instead of talking about what's the right balance of power between our parliament, between the House of Commons and the House of Lords, between local government and the devolved assemblies, and between citizens and their government.
Actually have a Bill of Rights.
A constitutional convention, a Bill of Rights would be a much better way to settle these. Otherwise, you just get, a sort of fight about nonsense all the time. And where I think the government is right is to pull this piece of legislation.
But I think the government
Martin has right that you can't just pass some made-up piece of law and pretend that takes you out of the European
No, I think
Convention.
government concern about the overreach of the European Court of Human Rights is a perfectly legitimate concern. And I don't agree with Stella that somehow the European Court has to be this kind of court of last resort for the poor old British citizen, because the British citizen
That's exactly what Churchill argued.
The British citizen, he argued it for kind of dictatorships. and things like that. But, you know, we've had British courts protecting the rights of British people or English people going back before the Union,
yes,
and Scottish courts for hundreds and hundreds of years.
I'm going to
habeas corpus is not based on a human rights act.
I'm going to pause this discussion, and actually we're going to go back to what you were saying a little bit earlier, Stella, in terms of your thoughts about the Queen's health. Liz Truss, the Prime Minister, has tweeted this: "The whole country will be deeply concerned by the news from Buckingham Palace this lunchtime. My thoughts and the thoughts of people across our United Kingdom are with Her Majesty the Queen and her family at this time." This follows the Speaker of the House of Commons interrupting the debate to update MPs on the health of the Queen. This statement from Buckingham Palace has been published saying, "Following further evaluation this morning, the Queen's doctors are concerned for Her Majesty's health and have recommended she remain under medical supervision. The Queen remains comfortable and at Balmoral." Obviously, this is a very serious state of affairs. It's a very serious statement, the fact that the House has been updated in terms of the Queen's health. She is 96. As I said, we saw her, images of her meeting the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, but clearly this is going to be a major focus.
I think so, and it's incredibly worrying that they felt the need to pause that Commons debate and inform the House of that. You look at that statement there from Buckingham Palace, and I think it is incredibly concerning that they felt the need to put this out at this moment in time.
Right. I mean, Ed, obviously, everybody now is going to want to be able to get the latest updates when it comes to...
Yeah, I mean, I think John is absolutely right. I mean, we've had, you know, the Queen has had health problems for a while, but it's unprecedented for the Speaker to interrupt what was a very important statement on energy to give the House an update on the Queen's health. I don't think he would have done that lightly.
No.
He will know, I'm sure his office will know that the statement put out by Buckingham Palace, although it's pretty relatively bland, and I'm not criticising them for that, is clearly there is something more behind this, and it is a very serious moment of concern. And I think Liz Truss is right, as I'm sure Keir Starmer is putting out a statement as well, that the whole nation, you know, I feel emotional about it, the whole nation will feel emotional about this. We wish the Queen well, but we know that a statement like that from the Speaker would not be made lightly.
No, absolutely. And also we are hearing and we understand that there is a statement coming from Clarence House. The Prince of Wales, the Duchess of Cornwall are apparently now travelling up to Balmoral. In a few moments' time, I think we can talk to the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason, and we'll talk to him as soon as we have the latest in terms of the Queen and her state of health. But as the Prime Minister said, the whole country will be deeply concerned by the news from Buckingham Palace this lunchtime. She said, "My thoughts and the thoughts of people across our United Kingdom are with Her Majesty the Queen and her family at this time." I think we can now actually play the full statement from the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, which we didn't have completely a little earlier. Let's have a listen.
I wish to say something about the announcement which has just been made about Her Majesty. I know I speak on behalf of the entire House when I say that we send our best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen and that she and the royal family are in our thoughts and prayers at this moment. I'm going to take no more, if there is anything else, we will update the House accordingly. Thank you.
Stella, as you said, you wanted to say personally that your thoughts are with the Queen. She is 96 years old. She has, we knew, mobility issues. She has, of course, come through the COVID pandemic as well as world wars, and she is somebody who is unbelievably stoic. But there will be deep concern following particularly the statement from Buckingham Palace and now the news that we know that the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall are travelling up to Balmoral.
Yeah, and look, I think obviously she's been a public figure in all of our lives for generations, but actually I think at these times, first and foremost, she's a grandmother, a great-grandmother, a mother. Like, I think of it if it was a member of my family and what I would think if I was seeing people talking about it on television. And I just feel we all need to be very respectful that nobody really knows quite what is happening. But above all, we hope that the doctors are with her and she's getting the treatment and the support that she needs, because of her family, because actually, as I say, if it was a member of my family, I would want first and foremost to be able to be with them.
Right, and the political reaction, of course, Liz Truss, only a few days into the role as Prime Minister, and will now be constantly updated on what is going on. I think we will be able to show you in a moment some of the images from her meeting Liz Truss a few days ago. But yes, this will be first and foremost, won't it, in people's minds?
Oh, exactly. I think that's why you've seen Liz Truss come out immediately with that statement. As Ed says, I'm sure that Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, will be doing the same. And just like everyone around the country, MPs are normal people. They just feel very moved and concerned about this. And as Stella said, you know, the Queen has been there for almost everyone in this country through our whole lives. She's been there in the good times, the bad times. She was there at the Olympics in 2012. She was there in the pandemic. You know, you think back to the pandemic, that address to that nation when she said, we will meet again. I mean, all of our emotions were raised at that point in time. It was a very difficult moment, but I did just find that such a poignant and moving statement at the time. She gets these things word perfect. I think that's exactly what the country needed in that moment in time.
Yes, well, let me just read for viewers who may be just joining us a statement from Buckingham Palace, which was obviously what was fed into Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the House of Commons, when he interrupted the debate, to say that following further evaluation this morning, the Queen's doctors are concerned for Her Majesty's health and have recommended she remain under medical supervision. The Queen remains comfortable and at Balmoral. And of course, she stayed at Balmoral instead of coming down to Buckingham Palace, which she normally would have done for a handover of power from Boris Johnson to Liz Truss. But they, in fact, travelled up to see her, and we saw those images of her meeting Liz Truss there. Let's talk to our political correspondent, Layla Nathu. She is in Central Lobby. Tell us what's happening there, because we saw Liz Truss leave the Commons chamber, the Prime Minister, presumably having been told this news.
Yeah, there was some indication that there was something afoot when Liz Truss was passed a note or whispered in her ear by Nadeem Zahawi, came and said something to Liz Truss. Angela Rayner also seemed to get a similar briefing for the Labour side. So there was some activity in the Commons in the middle of the kind of cut and thrust of the debate over the energy price guarantee that had just been announced that suggested there was something going on. Then, of course, we had the statement from Buckingham Palace, and then you heard the statement from Sir Lindsay Hoyle there, which he made in the Commons. Now, we've had a statement from the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Liz Truss, as you've been saying, has already made her statement. Keir Starmer has said, along with the rest of the country, I am deeply worried by the news from Buckingham Palace this afternoon. My thoughts are with Her Majesty the Queen and her family at this time, and I join everyone across the United Kingdom in hoping for her recovery. So the two party leaders sending their thoughts to the Queen and her family this lunchtime as the Commons was interrupted by that news.
Yeah, and politicians from across the House will no doubt be concerned. It'll be probably the whole conversation in Central Lobby and throughout the Palace of Westminster in terms of trying to find out or keep up with the state of the Queen's health.
Absolutely. You get the sense that just how things come to a halt when news like this is heard. And you saw that in the middle of the debate. This was, remember, the defining policy of Liz Truss's first days in government. That was going to be the conversation today, and immediately in the middle of that, this activity and then thoughts and attention rapidly focusing elsewhere. So yes, I imagine as MPs start to filter out, everyone waiting eagerly for news on the latest updates, but certainly now the priority for the two parties is to wait and hear the latest from Buckingham Palace and then see what happens next.
Layla Nathu there at Central Lobby, BBC political correspondent. Thank you very much. And as Layla was saying, Liz Truss left the chamber of the House of Commons, and she was in the middle of her statement about energy bills, but obviously says that she shares the concerns of the whole nation about the Queen's health following that statement from Buckingham Palace. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me here today. And of course, if there are any developments, they'll be on BBC News. Bye-bye.